The following video contains language that some may find offensive. Viewer discretion advised.
Every language has slang. Slang can define a country, a culture, a generation, or a person. It is an integral part of language, especially in the United States. We use it all the time, sometimes without even realizing. But where do these slang words come from? Why are they important?
Slang consists of words being spoken in an informal manner in order to create a specific identity. Slang is always evolving. The words and phrases that were popular in the past may now be deemed uncool, or may have taken on a new meaning entirely. In other words, it may no longer be hip to be hip. One such transformation has come through the word shit. We spoke with Dr. Andrew Bird about the term's origin.
What can you tell us about the etymology of shit?
Now, shit, we have a much better idea of where this thing came from. This word probably derives from a Proto-Indo-European root sec, meaning to cut. Okay, now this is directly continued by Latin secco, secare, I cut. We still see that sec in our word section. So a section is a cutting of something. And we still see that also within a segment, right? So that's all the same root. Now that said, if we go over to this board over here, sec, for reasons I won't explain, becomes skid within Germanic, okay? Now skid, through Grimm's law, becomes skit, so the D becomes a T, just as, in Italian, the word for 10 is dieci, we have 10, right? And then regularly we see the ska sequence becoming a sha, and there we have shit. Now if you're wondering how cut becomes shit, well essentially when you go to the bathroom, when you take a shit, you cut something. And that's it. I think there's an expression to pinch a loaf, right? So I mean, you kind of get the idea. It's gross, but that's, I think, the idea.
Folk etymologies, as linguists call them, are stories speakers tell about the sources of certain words. They are often backronyms, phrases that are constructed to fit a supposed acronym rather than the other way around. Examples include store high in transit, fornication under consent of the king, or before anyone else, none of which are the true etymologies of the terms.
What can you tell us about the etymology of fuck?
So this is a root that we reconstruct for Proto-Indo-European pogue. That's how they would have said it. And that actually kind of sounds like the word poke. And that's what it meant. It meant to poke, to stick something. Now we see this root realized within Latin pungo, meaning I stick, I poke something, right? And this actually is continued in English today with the word pungent. So pungent smell is something that sticks you in the nose. Now, how does all of this become fuck? Well, so if we start with pogue, the meaning to poke gets kind of specified as you're poking a person, right? And then that through metaphor becomes have sex with.
Do you know where the word bay comes from?
The only thing that I've ever heard about the word bay is that it's supposed to be like an acronym before anyone else or before anything else or something like that.
I don't know where it comes from, but if I was to guess, I would say 16-year-old girls. I've heard it's an acronym, but I'm not sure what it actually stands for.
Folk etymologies indicate a desire on the part of the speakers to better understand their language, either by modifying a word or phrase so that it's in a more digestible form, or by inventing backstories about how a word came into existence. These stories and modifications allow speakers to identify more strongly with their language, making it more uniquely theirs by inserting themselves and their speech into a historical tradition they better understand. The true etymologies of these terms, coming from Old English, Proto-Germanic, Latin, Proto-Indo-European, and so on, do little for the speakers to add to the character of their language, and so are comparatively less useful for the everyday speaker.
Semantic drift is the way in which words evolve over time. Many words that had set and accepted definitions centuries or even decades ago are now considered to have different meanings. Some of those meanings are still related to the original definition, and some are complete shifts. These changes are usually social in nature, and with the advent of social media, words are evolving faster than ever.
What does dope mean?
The word dope today. I feel like it's more of like similar to the word cool. Like that's really cool. But like, oh man, that's dope.
Dope can mean a few things. In its descriptive form, it's something that's really cool. You know, hey, that's dope. You know, that was, that concert was dope. Whatever you want to say.
It has two meanings. The first one would be drugs, and then the second one means good.
Do you consider dope to be a slang word?
Yeah, I think dope is a very good example of modern day slang. It's something that slang is something that changes with time, and over the past few years, there's been numerous slang words that I've heard come and go, and dope has been around since I was little, probably.
And its modern sense, the way it's mostly used, dope these days is definitely more of a slang term.
Do you and other people still use the word dope?
Yes, I find myself using the word dope almost every day, probably, to describe things, and I hear it a lot around campus. People, it's more of an everyday vocabulary word.
Well, the word dope is in and of itself dope. So why would I not use such a dope-ass word as dope?
I don't, but I know people that do, and I don't like it.
What does the word hipster mean?
Well, to be honest, people kind of use hipster as kind of like a derogatory term, I feel like, nowadays. But a hipster is someone who tries to, I don't want to say anti-mainstream in any sort of like bad way, but you know, they definitely sort of go against the grain in terms of like what the masses are doing, and they like to maybe do what they think is like morally and ethically right with their, you know, business transactions and stuff like that.
To me, it means someone that's cool and just dresses cool, and they're always in a chill mode.
For me, hipster means just like a referring to a person that has a different fashion, just like to me, when I think of a hipster, a person that's wearing tight jeans and like a hat, and I would just say, oh, you're a hipster just because of what you're wearing. To me, that's what it comes to mind.
Do you or other people still use the word hipster?
I don't use the word very much anymore. A few 2-3 years ago, I used to hear it almost every day, but now it seems to be not so much of a common thing anymore.
Yeah, I don't go out of my way to use it, but I do tend to use the word hipster when talking about hipsters.
I don't use it, but I find it very common when with my group of people, like friends, they use it a lot.
Do you consider hipster to be slang?
Yeah, I do consider hipster to be slang because I feel like it's a word that people started using on their own rather than it was given to them.
Factors like gender, cultural background, and nationality can affect the way slang is perceived. Speakers and writers use slang to reach specific audiences, typically in casual and informal settings. For example, a college student might approach their friend and say, "Yo man, what's good?" Whereas the same student would approach a professor by saying, "Good afternoon, sir. How are you doing today?"
Knowing your audience is important. Things to consider when using slang are what kind of audience are you trying to reach? Will they comprehend the language in this context? And will your tone of voice be understood?
How can slang influence how people are viewed by others?
So, given that forms of slang are often sort of really specific to particular groups, particularly sort of young people, for example, using slang is a sort of major way that people construct their sort of social identity to present to others. So if someone sort of uses slang in a way that doesn't fit expectations of who they are, then they'll sound really strange, right? So if you had a 60-year-old man talking about how he was on fleek, then that might sort of provoke laughter.
And so, why might someone choose to use slang over a more standard term?
So part of the reasons that slang that slang is predominantly something you find with young people is that it's a way of sort of marking yourself as different from some other group. So some linguists sort of hold that slang is predominant during adolescence because at that age, young people are trying to distinguish themselves from their parents, and so they want to use language that's somehow different from their parents and not what the generation above them is doing. So they sort of take new words and come up with sort of innovative ways of talking that sort of mark them as a distinctive generation from those before them. And then the next generation after them is going to come up with something different and not use the same terms, right? So.
Could you tell us a little bit about accommodation theory?
So accommodation theory sort of holds that people accommodate or sometimes disaccommodate to the person they're talking to. So when you're speaking with someone, you adjust your speech to sort of match them in different ways, from everything from how fast you're talking to the type of language you're using. Whether or not you're using slang would be another sort of feature of that. And so when people are getting along and sort of in agreement, they tend to sort of move closer together in terms of accommodation. So their language will sort of come together. But if people are in some sort of conflict, then it's likely to have the opposite happen, where people will make distinctions between their speech to mark that they're not like the person they're talking to.
How would you define slang?
To me, it's a pretty simple definition, oddly enough, because the definition of slang is, if it's not in the dictionary, it is slang.
What is the most common slang word that you use?
I would have to say it's a word that some people might not even consider slang. I would say the word cool. I use it for confirmation, like, yeah, that's cool.
As much as I hate to admit it, probably bro and all of its variations, like bruh, for instance, which is lame, but lame's also another common one that I use, so lame might be the one.
Language can be thought of as a tool in the hands of speakers. It is used to accomplish a social goal, to express power, friendliness, membership in a culture, and so on. Slang can be used to a great effect towards all of these ends, with a specific term to express a stance or as marking one as a member of a group.
Our ideas about language and its origins shape how we perceive ourselves in the context of our speech. It adapts over time to better match the requirements of those who use it, with meaning shifting based on our ideas and opinions about the matters in question. Its use helps speakers to better express themselves, both in specific conversation and overall as people, allowing them to better decide how they're seen.